Sometimes the most extraordinary stories hide in the most ordinary places. Sometimes a worn-out piece of clothing carries more history than entire museums. Sometimes what we dismiss as worthless holds the power to stop a four-star general in his tracks and bring tears to the eyes of hardened soldiers. What would you do if you discovered that the old jacket hanging in your grandfather's closet wasn't just any jacket, but a piece of living history that had witnessed some of the most crucial moments of World War II? What if that faded patch on the sleeve could unlock secrets that had been buried for over 70 years? This is the true story of Michael Harrison, a young man who thought he was just cleaning out his late grandfather's belongings, and how one moment of curiosity changed everything he thought he knew about his family, his country, and the true meaning of heroism. Get ready for a journey that will take you from a dusty attic in small-town America to the battlefields of Europe, from a grandson's innocent discovery to a nation's recognition of forgotten heroes. This is a story about courage that was never meant to be found, sacrifice that was never meant to be remembered, and honor that refused to stay hidden. The jacket was just the beginning. Michael Harrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he climbed the narrow wooden stairs to his grandfather's attic. The old house creaked beneath his feet, each step stirring up decades of dust and memories. 3 weeks had passed since Grandpa Joe's funeral, and the family had finally gathered the courage to begin sorting through his belongings. The attic was exactly what Michael had expected: a maze of cardboard boxes, old furniture covered in white sheets, and the musty smell of time itself. His grandfather had been a quiet man who rarely spoke about his past, especially the war years. The family knew he had served in World War II, but Joe Harrison had always changed the subject whenever anyone asked about his military service. Michael's mother, Sarah, had asked him to look through the attic while she and his aunt sorted through the main floor items. At 28, Michael was the only grandchild who lived nearby, and he had always felt a special connection to his grandfather. They had spent countless afternoons together, with Joe teaching him how to fix cars, telling stories about the neighborhood's history, and sharing his love for old baseball games on the radio. As Michael moved between the boxes, he noticed one corner of the attic that seemed different from the rest. A large trunk sat beneath a small window, its dark leather surface cracked with age. Unlike everything else in the attic, this trunk appeared to have been recently accessed. The dust around it was disturbed, and Michael could see fingerprints on the metal clasps. His heart raced with curiosity as he approached the trunk. He had never seen it before, despite spending countless hours in this house throughout his childhood. The trunk was heavy, made of thick leather with brass fittings that had turned green with age. As he lifted the lid, the hinges groaned in protest, and the smell of old leather and mothballs filled the air. Inside, Michael found carefully folded military uniforms, their olive green fabric still in remarkable condition despite their age. There were photographs he had never seen, medals in small velvet boxes, and documents bearing official military seals. But what caught his attention most was a worn leather jacket lying at the bottom of the trunk. The jacket was clearly military issue, but it looked different from the formal uniforms above it. It was darker, more weathered, with evidence of hard use. The leather was soft from wear, and there were small tears and stains that told stories Michael could only imagine. On the left sleeve was a patch that he didn't recognize, a shield with wings and what appeared to be lightning bolts. Michael lifted the jacket carefully, surprised by how heavy it felt. As he examined it more closely, he noticed that one of the pockets seemed to bulge slightly. Reaching inside, his fingers touched something hard and rectangular. He pulled out a small metal case, tarnished with age, about the size of a cigarette case but thicker. The case was locked, but the mechanism was old and loose. With gentle pressure, it opened to reveal contents that made Michael's breath catch in his throat. Inside were several items that seemed completely out of place in his grandfather's attic: foreign currency from multiple countries, small photographs of people he didn't recognize, and what appeared to be coded messages written on thin paper. But the most shocking discovery was a set of identity papers, not just American military identification, but documents that suggested his grandfather had been someone entirely different during the war. The papers were in different languages, with different names, and they all bore his grandfather's photograph. Michael sat back on his heels, staring at the contents of the case. His grandfather, the quiet man who had run a small auto repair shop for 40 years, the man who had never traveled farther than the next state, apparently had a past that was far more complex than anyone in the family had ever imagined. He spent the next hour carefully examining everything in the trunk. There were maps with markings in pencil, photographs of groups of men in military gear, and letters written in what appeared to be code. One photograph particularly caught his attention. It showed his grandfather, looking impossibly young, standing with a group of men in front of what appeared to be a military aircraft. They all wore the same type of jacket that Michael now held in his hands. The strangest thing was that none of these items matched the official military records the family had seen. According to those records, Joe Harrison had been a mechanic with an engineering unit that had served in England and France. The items in this trunk suggested something entirely different, something that involved multiple countries, dangerous missions, and a level of secrecy that Michael was only beginning to understand. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the attic floor, Michael carefully repacked everything except the jacket. Something about it called to him, perhaps because it was the most personal item among all the military gear. This jacket had clearly been worn, lived in, and had been with his grandfather through experiences that the rest of the family knew nothing about. He decided to take the jacket downstairs to show his mother. Perhaps she would know something about her father's past that she had never shared. As he descended the attic stairs, the jacket draped over his arm, Michael felt as though he was carrying more than just a piece of old clothing. He was carrying secrets that had been hidden for over 70 years. In the kitchen, his mother was sorting through a box of his grandfather's papers, utility bills, insurance documents, and other mundane reminders of an ordinary life. She looked up as Michael entered, and her expression immediately changed when she saw what he was carrying. "Where did you find that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In a trunk in the attic." "Mom, did you know about any of this?" "There's a whole collection of military gear up there that doesn't match what we were told about Grandpa's service." Sarah reached out to touch the jacket, her fingers tracing the patch on the sleeve. Her eyes filled with tears, and, for a moment, she seemed to be seeing something that wasn't in the room with them. "He told me once, when I was very young, that there were things about the war that he could never talk about. Things that had to stay secret forever. I thought he meant the usual horrible things that soldiers see in combat. I never imagined." Her voice trailed off as she continued to examine the jacket. "What do you think this patch means?" Michael asked, pointing to the shield with wings and lightning bolts. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out. Your grandfather spent his whole life keeping these secrets, but maybe it's time for the truth to come out. He's gone now, and maybe these secrets don't need to stay buried with him." That evening, Michael took the jacket home to his apartment. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strong connection to it, as though it was meant to be with him. He hung it carefully in his closet, next to his own clothes, and found himself looking at it frequently over the next few days. The patch intrigued him most. He had never seen anything like it in any of the World War II documentaries he had watched or books he had read. The design was distinctive, clearly military, but different from the standard patches he was familiar with. The lightning bolts in particular seemed unusual for a traditional military unit insignia. Michael decided to do some research. He started with online searches, trying to find information about the patch design and any military units that might have used it during World War II. The initial searches turned up nothing, but he was persistent. He expanded his research to include special operations units, intelligence groups, and other specialized military organizations from the war. After several days of searching, he found a reference in an obscure military history forum. Someone had posted a question about a similar patch design, asking if anyone knew what unit it represented. The responses were limited, but one caught Michael's attention. A user claimed that the patch belonged to a highly classified unit that had operated during World War II, but that most records of their activities were still classified or had been destroyed. The user had included a suggestion that anyone interested in learning more should contact the National Archives or military historians who specialized in special operations units from the war. Michael made note of these suggestions, but he also felt frustrated by how little information was available. As he continued his research, Michael began to realize that his grandfather's secrets might be bigger than he had initially thought. This wasn't just about a soldier who had seen combat and didn't want to talk about it. This was about someone who had been involved in activities so secret that there were virtually no public records of them. The jacket became Michael's constant reminder of the mystery he was trying to solve. Every time he looked at it, he saw new details, small repairs that had been made to the leather, stains that might have come from anything, and where patterns that suggested it had been worn frequently under difficult conditions. He also noticed something else about the jacket: it fit him perfectly. Despite being over 70 years old, despite having been made for his grandfather who had been a smaller man, the jacket fit Michael as though it had been tailored for him. This strange coincidence only deepened his feeling that he was meant to uncover the truth about his grandfather's past. 2 weeks after finding the trunk, Michael had filled several notebooks with information he had gathered about special operations units from World War II, classified military operations, and anything else that might provide clues about his grandfather's real role in the war. The more he learned, the more questions he had. He had also made a decision. He was going to wear the jacket to the Veterans Day ceremony that was being held at the local community center the following week. It seemed like an appropriate place to honor his grandfather's memory, and perhaps someone there might recognize the patch or have information about the unit it represented. Michael had no way of knowing that this decision would set in motion events that would change not only his understanding of his grandfather's past, but also his own future. The jacket that had been hidden in an attic for decades was about to be seen by someone who would recognize its significance immediately. As he prepared for bed that night, Michael looked once more at the jacket hanging in his closet. Tomorrow, he would begin making phone calls to military historians and archives. He would continue his search for the truth about his grandfather's secrets. He had no idea that the answers he was seeking were closer than he thought, and that the jacket itself would soon reveal secrets that had been kept hidden for over 7 decades. The old leather seemed to hold stories in every crease and stain. Soon, those stories would finally be told. The Veterans Day ceremony at the Riverside Community Center was larger than Michael had expected. The parking lot was full of cars displaying military license plates and bumper stickers, and a steady stream of elderly veterans, their families, and community members were making their way toward the building. Michael adjusted the leather jacket as he walked from his car, feeling both proud and nervous about wearing his grandfather's military gear. Inside, the community center had been decorated with American flags, patriotic bunting, and displays honoring local veterans from various wars. Round tables filled the main hall, each decorated with small flags and photographs of veterans from the community. A stage at the front of the room was set up for speakers, and Michael could see a podium with microphone equipment being tested by volunteers. Michael found a seat toward the back of the room, wanting to observe more than participate. He had come hoping that someone might recognize his grandfather's patch, but now that he was here, surrounded by so many veterans and their families, he felt uncertain about approaching anyone with questions. The jacket felt heavier than usual, weighted with the secrets it carried. As the ceremony began, Michael listened to speeches from local officials, a representative from the American Legion, and several veterans who shared brief stories about their service. The atmosphere was respectful and patriotic, but also comfortable and familiar, like a large family gathering. Many of the attendees clearly knew each other, exchanging greetings and catching up on family news between the formal presentations. During a break in the program, while people were getting coffee and visiting the displays around the room, Michael decided to examine some of the historical exhibits more closely. One table featured photographs and memorabilia from World War II veterans in the area, and he thought he might find some clues about military units or patches that resembled his grandfather's. As he studied a display of military insignia, Michael became aware that someone was standing very close behind him. He turned to find an elderly man in a crisp military dress uniform, his chest covered with ribbons and medals. The man's eyes were fixed intently on Michael's jacket, specifically on the patch on the left sleeve. "Excuse me, son," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military command. "Where did you get that jacket?" Michael felt a flutter of nervousness. The man's tone wasn't accusatory, but it was intense, as though the question was extremely important to him. The man appeared to be in his 80s, with silver hair and the erect posture that many career military men maintained even in their later years. "It belonged to my grandfather," Michael replied. "I found it in his attic after he passed away a few weeks ago. He served in World War II." The elderly man's expression grew even more serious. He stepped closer, examining the patch more carefully. Michael noticed that other people nearby had stopped their conversations and were watching the exchange with interest. "What was your grandfather's name?" the man asked. "Joe Harrison. Joseph Harrison." The elderly man's face went completely pale. He stared at Michael for a long moment, then at the jacket, then back at Michael's face. His hand moved toward his chest, and for a moment Michael worried that the man might be having a health emergency. "Joseph Harrison," the man repeated slowly. "Joe Harrison from the 487th. The 487th? I've never heard of that unit. The records we have say he served with an engineering battalion." The elderly man shook his head slowly. "Son, your grandfather and I served together in one of the most classified units of World War II. The 487th Operations Group. We were part of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. What you're wearing is more than just a jacket, it's one of the rarest pieces of military history in existence." Michael felt the room spinning slightly. The OSS, he had read about them during his research. They were the predecessors to the CIA, involved in espionage, sabotage, and other covert operations during the war. Most of their activities had remained classified for decades. "I'm General Robert Mitchell, retired," the man continued. "I was a lieutenant when I knew your grandfather, but Joe Harrison saved my life more times than I can count. We served together for 3 years behind enemy lines." The general's voice had changed, becoming softer but filled with emotion. Michael noticed that a small crowd had gathered around them, other veterans and their families listening to every word. "General, I think there's been some mistake," Michael said. "My grandfather was just a mechanic. He never talked about being involved in anything like espionage or covert operations." General Mitchell smiled sadly. "Of course he didn't. We were all sworn to secrecy, and Joe Harrison was one of the most honorable men I ever knew. He would have taken those secrets to his grave, and apparently he did." The general paused, looking around at the people who were now openly staring at them. He seemed to make a decision. "Son, would you mind if we talked privately? There are things about your grandfather that you need to know, things that this community should know. Joe Harrison was a hero in ways that most people can't even imagine." Michael nodded, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. General Mitchell led him to a quiet corner of the room, away from the crowd but still within view of the other ceremony attendees. Several other elderly veterans followed at a respectful distance, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and recognition. "The patch you're wearing represents the 487th Operations Group," General Mitchell began. "We were inserted into occupied Europe multiple times between 1943 and 1945. Our missions included intelligence gathering, sabotage of enemy facilities, coordination with resistance groups, and extraction of Allied personnel from behind enemy lines." Michael listened in amazement as the general described operations that sounded like something from a spy novel. According to Mitchell, his grandfather had been involved in some of the most dangerous and important covert operations of the war. "Joe was our communications specialist and mechanic, but he was also one of our most reliable operatives for infiltration missions. He spoke German fluently, did you know that? He could pass for a native speaker, which made him invaluable for certain operations." Michael shook his head. His grandfather had never spoken German around the family, had never mentioned knowing any foreign languages at all. "Why was it all kept secret for so long?" Michael asked. "Several reasons," General Mitchell explained. "First, many of our operations involved techniques and technologies that remained classified long after the war ended. Second, we worked with resistance groups and individuals whose safety could have been compromised if their cooperation became public knowledge. And third, some of our missions involved activities in countries that became our allies after the war, and revealing details could have been diplomatically sensitive." The general gestured toward Michael's jacket. "There were only about 200 men who served in the 487th during the entire war. Most of the jackets like that one were destroyed or lost. The fact that your grandfather kept his, and that you found it, is remarkable." As they continued to talk, other veterans began to approach. Word had spread quickly through the room that someone was wearing authentic OSS gear, and several elderly men wanted to share their own memories of the war or ask questions about the jacket. One man, introduced as Frank Sullivan, had served with the regular army but had encountered OSS operatives during the liberation of France. "I always wondered what happened to those guys," he said, examining Michael's jacket with obvious respect. "They would show up, conduct their business, and disappear again. We knew they were doing important work, but we never knew any details." Another veteran, Maria Rodriguez, had served as a nurse in field hospitals and remembered treating OSS operatives who had been wounded during covert operations. "They never talked about their missions, even when they were delirious with fever," she recalled. The secrecy was that complete. General Mitchell continued to share memories of Michael's grandfather. According to him, Joe Harrison had been involved in at least a dozen major operations, including missions that had saved hundreds of Allied lives and disrupted significant enemy activities. "There was one operation in particular," the general said, lowering his voice even though they were among friends. "We were tasked with destroying a German communications facility in occupied France. The operation went wrong, and we were separated from our extraction team. Joe managed to get us to a resistance safe house and then spent 3 days repairing a damaged radio under enemy fire so we could call for backup." "He never mentioned any of this," Michael said. "Never even hinted at it. That was Joe. He was the most humble man I ever knew, despite being one of the bravest. He saved my life during that same operation. We were pinned down by German patrols, and Joe volunteered to create a distraction so the rest of us could escape. He spent 2 days evading capture in enemy territory before making it back to Allied lines." The general reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I've kept track of as many 487th veterans as I could over the years. There are only 12 of us left now, and Joe's death reduces that number to 11. We've talked about having some kind of reunion or memorial service, but we could never include Joe because we didn't know how to contact him without revealing classified information." Michael was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his grandfather had been part of, and also the weight of the secret he had carried for his entire adult life. "Why are you telling me all this now? Isn't it still classified?" General Mitchell smiled. "Most of the OSS records were declassified in the 1990s, but the information was never widely publicized. The operations we were involved in are now part of the historical record, but very few people know to look for them. Your grandfather could have talked about his service any time after 1995, but he chose not to." "Maybe he didn't know the records had been declassified," Michael suggested. "Maybe. Or maybe he was just so accustomed to keeping the secret that he couldn't bring himself to break it, even when it was no longer necessary." The ceremony was resuming, but Michael found it difficult to concentrate on the speakers. His mind was racing with questions about his grandfather's past and the implications of what he had learned. The jacket that he had worn as a tribute to his grandfather's memory had revealed a whole hidden chapter of family history. During the closing remarks of the ceremony, General Mitchell was called to the stage. The Master of Ceremonies explained that the general had served with distinction in both World War II and the Korean War, and had retired as one of the most decorated officers in his unit. As General Mitchell approached the podium, he gestured for Michael to join him on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share something with you today that illustrates why we gather for ceremonies like this one." Michael felt hundreds of eyes on him as he stood next to the general at the front of the room. The leather jacket suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. This young man is wearing a jacket that belonged to his grandfather, Joseph Harrison. Until today, Joe's family believed he had served as a mechanic during World War II. What they didn't know is that Joe Harrison was one of the most decorated covert operatives of the war, a member of a highly classified unit that conducted some of the most dangerous and important missions of the European theater. The room was completely silent. General Mitchell continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Joe Harrison and men like him are the reason we're here today. They served with honor, courage, and humility. They kept secrets for over 70 years because they believed it was their duty to do so. This jacket represents not just one man's service, but the service of an entire generation of heroes whose stories were never told." The general turned to face Michael. "Son, your grandfather would be proud to know that his story is finally being told, and that his sacrifice is finally being recognized." The applause that followed was unlike anything Michael had ever heard. It wasn't just polite appreciation, it was the sound of an entire community expressing gratitude for sacrifices they were only now beginning to understand. After the ceremony, Michael was surrounded by people who wanted to hear more about his grandfather's service, to share their own family military stories, or simply to touch the jacket that represented such an important piece of history. General Mitchell stayed close, helping to answer questions and providing additional details about the 487th Operations Group. As the evening wound down, the general gave Michael his business card. "There are some people I'd like you to meet," he said. "Other 487th veterans, historians who specialize in OSS operations, and some folks at the National Archives who have been trying to piece together the complete story of our unit. Your grandfather's jacket and the items you found in that trunk could help fill in some missing pieces of history." Michael looked down at the jacket he was wearing. A few hours ago, it had been just a mysterious piece of his grandfather's past. Now it was a key that was opening doors to stories that had been locked away for decades. "General, there's something else," Michael said. "I found other items in my grandfather's trunk. Documents, photographs, maps. Things that might be important to the historians you mentioned." General Mitchell's eyes lit up. "Son, you may have just made one of the most important historical discoveries in decades. The 487th lost most of its records in a fire in 1946. If your grandfather saved operational documents, they could be the only complete record of what we did during the war." As Michael drove home that evening, the jacket on the passenger seat beside him, he realized that his life had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a man who had lost his grandfather, he was now the guardian of secrets that belonged to history, and the keeper of stories that needed to be told. The leather jacket that had started as a sentimental keepsake had become something much more significant. It was a bridge between the past and the present, between secrets and truth, between a family's questions and the answers that had been waiting decades to be discovered. Michael's phone had been ringing almost constantly since the Veterans Day ceremony. Word had spread quickly through veteran networks, military history circles, and even online forums about the discovery of authentic OSS materials from the 487th Operations Group. General Mitchell had been true to his word, connecting Michael with historians, archivists, and other veterans who were eager to learn more about his grandfather's service. The first formal meeting took place at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. Michael made the 3-hour drive with a carefully packed box containing everything he had found in his grandfather's trunk, except for the jacket, which he wore. He felt strange traveling with classified historical documents in his car, even though General Mitchell had assured him that everything was now legally declassified and could be shared with proper authorities. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in OSS records at the archives, met Michael at the security desk. She was a woman in her 40s with an obvious passion for military history, and her excitement about examining his grandfather's materials was infectious. "Mr. Harrison, what you've brought us could represent the most complete collection of 487th Operations Group materials in existence," she explained as they walked through the secure corridors of the facility. Most OSS operational records were either destroyed deliberately after the war or lost in various fires and accidents over the years. Personal collections like your grandfather's are incredibly rare. They entered a climate-controlled examination room where white cotton gloves, magnifying equipment, and document photography gear had been prepared. Dr. Chen had also arranged for 2 other specialists to participate in the examination, Dr. James Wright, a military historian who had written extensively about OSS operations, and Margaret Torres, a documents authentication expert. As Michael carefully unpacked his grandfather's materials onto the examination table, he could see the excitement building among the historians. The leather case alone caused a stir. It was apparently a type of concealment device that OSS operatives used to carry sensitive materials, and very few examples had survived the war. "This case is remarkable," Dr. Wright observed, carefully examining the mechanism that Michael had opened so casually weeks earlier. "The design is consistent with OSS equipment from 1943 to 1945. The fact that it still contains operational materials is unprecedented. The identification papers that had so confused Michael turned out to be examples of the false documentation that OSS operatives carried during covert missions. His grandfather's ability to assume different identities had been crucial to his effectiveness as an intelligence operative. Your grandfather operated under at least 4 different identities during the war, Dr. Chen explained, photographing each set of papers. Joseph Harrison was his real name and his cover identity as a mechanic. But he also operated as Jean-Claude Moreau in France, Heinrich Müller in Germany, and James MacDonald in Scotland. Each identity was complete with backstory, documentation, and even personal items that would support his cover. The coded messages revealed even more fascinating details. Margaret Torres was able to decode several of them using OSS cipher keys that had been declassified in the 1990s. The messages described mission parameters, rendezvous points, and intelligence gathered during operations behind enemy lines. One message, dated March 1944, described a successful operation to destroy a German radar installation in occupied France. Another, from August 1944, detailed intelligence gathered about German troop movements prior to the liberation of Paris. A third message, coded as Priority Alpha, described the successful extraction of a British intelligence operative who had been captured by the Germans. This message is particularly significant, Dr. Wright said, pointing to the Priority Alpha communication. We have German records indicating that a British agent escaped from custody during this time period, but we never had Allied records confirming the rescue operation. Your grandfather's message proves that it was an OSS mission that saved this operative's life. The photographs in the trunk provided additional pieces of the puzzle. Several showed groups of men in civilian clothes standing in front of various European landmarks, but Dr. Chen was able to identify them as OSS operatives based on subtle details in their postures and equipment. OSS personnel were trained to appear as normal civilians, she explained. But there are small indicators that trained observers can recognize. The way they stand, how they position themselves in group photos, even how they wear their civilian clothes reflects their military training. One photograph particularly caught the historian's attention. It showed Michael's grandfather with 3 other men standing beside what appeared to be a small aircraft. The plane was not a type that any of them immediately recognized, and the setting suggested it might have been taken at a clandestine airfield. This could be documentation of a Lysander operation, Dr. Wright suggested, referring to the small British aircraft that were used to insert and extract agents from occupied territory. If so, it would be one of the few photographs we have of such operations. As the examination continued, Michael learned more about the scope of his grandfather's wartime activities than he had ever imagined possible. The materials documented operations in France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. They showed that his grandfather had worked with French resistance groups, Dutch underground organizations, and even anti-Nazi Germans who were working against their own government. The most remarkable discovery came when Dr. Chen found a small notebook tucked into a hidden compartment in the leather case. The notebook contained what appeared to be personal observations written in his grandfather's handwriting, but in a code that was different from the official OSS ciphers. This might be a personal cipher that your grandfather developed for his own use, she explained. OSS operatives were encouraged to develop their own security measures for personal documentation. Decoding this could give us insight into your grandfather's thoughts and experiences during the war. Margaret Torres spent several hours working with the personal cipher, trying different approaches to decode the notebook entries. Finally, she had a breakthrough when she realized that the code was based on a combination of his grandfather's childhood address and his mother's maiden name. The decoded entries revealed a side of the war that official reports could never capture. Joseph Harrison had written about his fears before dangerous missions, his concern for the safety of the resistance fighters he worked with, and his hope that the war would end soon so he could return to his normal life. One entry, dated December 1944, was particularly moving: completed extraction of downed airman today. Young pilot, maybe 20 years old, reminded me of my brother Tommy. Got him safely to resistance contact. Hope he makes it home to his family. Sometimes I wonder if what we're doing really makes a difference, but then I think about boys like this pilot, and I know we have to keep going. Another entry, from February 1945, revealed the personal cost of his covert activities: had to abandon safe house in Bruges. Germans got too close. Belgian family that helped us is now in danger because of our presence. This is the hardest part, knowing that good people suffer because they chose to help us. I pray they stay safe." The historians were amazed by the completeness and quality of the materials. Dr. Chen estimated that the documents represented information about more than 30 separate operations, some of which had never been documented in official records. "Your grandfather was involved in some of the most successful OSS operations of the European theater," Dr. Wright told Michael. "The destruction of the radar installation alone probably saved hundreds of Allied aircraft and their crews. The intelligence he gathered about German troop movements contributed to the success of the D-Day landings." As the day progressed, other experts arrived to examine specific aspects of the collection. A weapons specialist identified several photographs of experimental OSS equipment that had been considered lost. A communications expert found references to radio procedures that filled gaps in their understanding of wartime intelligence operations. The examination was scheduled to continue for several days, with different specialists focusing on various aspects of the materials. Michael arranged to stay in the area, both to participate in the investigation and to learn as much as possible about his grandfather's wartime service. That evening, Dr. Chen invited Michael to dinner with several other historians who specialized in OSS research. The conversation continued to focus on his grandfather's materials and their significance to the historical record. "What strikes me most about your grandfather's collection is how carefully he preserved everything," Dr. Wright observed. "Most operatives destroyed their materials after the war, either because they were ordered to or because they wanted to put the experience behind them. The fact that your grandfather kept everything suggests that he understood the historical importance of what he had been part of." "But why didn't he ever talk about it?" Michael asked. "Even after the records were declassified, he never said anything to the family." Dr. Chen considered this question thoughtfully. "There are several possible reasons. First, the habit of secrecy becomes very deeply ingrained. After keeping something secret for decades, it becomes almost impossible to talk about, even when it's no longer necessary to keep it secret. Second," added Dr. Wright, "many OSS veterans suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The operations they were involved in were incredibly dangerous and stressful. Some veterans found it easier to simply not think about those experiences rather than relive them by talking about them. There's also the possibility that your grandfather was protecting not just operational secrets, but personal ones as well," Dr. Chen suggested. "OSS operatives often formed close relationships with resistance fighters and civilians who helped them. Some of those people might still have been alive when the records were declassified, and revealing details about the operations could have put them or their families at risk." The next morning, Michael returned to the archives to continue the examination. Word about the discovery had spread even further, and several additional specialists had requested permission to examine specific items from the collection. One of the new arrivals was Colonel Patricia Stevens, a retired Army intelligence officer who had written her doctoral dissertation on OSS operations in occupied Europe. She was particularly interested in the maps that Michael had found in the trunk. "These maps are remarkable," she explained as she examined them under magnification. "They show safe houses, escape routes, and resistance contact points that were never included in official OSS maps. Your grandfather was apparently creating his own reference materials for operations." The marks on the maps told stories of successful missions and narrow escapes. Red marks indicated locations where operations had been compromised. Blue marks showed successful rendezvous points. Green marks indicated safe houses that could be trusted. Colonel Stevens was able to correlate some of the map markings with known historical events. One series of marks showed the route that Allied airmen used to escape from occupied Belgium to neutral Switzerland. Another set of markings indicated the locations of German checkpoints and patrol patterns that OSS operatives needed to avoid. "Your grandfather was essentially creating an intelligence database," she explained. "This level of detailed operational mapping shows a sophisticated understanding of the intelligence environment in occupied Europe." Dr. Chen had arranged for a photographer to create high-resolution digital images of all the materials, ensuring that they would be preserved for future research even after the originals were returned to Michael. The process was meticulous, with each document being photographed from multiple angles and under different lighting conditions. As the photography session progressed, Michael had time to reflect on everything he had learned about his grandfather's wartime service. The quiet man who had spent his post-war years fixing cars and following baseball had been involved in operations that helped change the course of world history. The most significant revelation came on the third day of examination, when Dr. Wright made a connection between Michael's grandfather's materials and a classified operation that had remained mysterious for decades. Operation Nightingale, Dr. Wright announced excitedly, showing Michael a decoded message from the personal notebook. Your grandfather was part of Operation Nightingale, one of the most successful OSS missions of the war. Operation Nightingale had been a complex mission involving the coordination of multiple resistance groups to disrupt German supply lines prior to D-Day. The operation had been so successful that German forces had been forced to divert significant resources to protect their supply routes, weakening their ability to respond to the Normandy invasion. Official records of Operation Nightingale were lost in the 1946 fire, Dr. Wright explained. Military historians have known that the operation occurred, and we knew it was successful, but we never had details about how it was executed. Your grandfather's materials provide the first complete documentation of how this mission was carried out. The implications were staggering. Michael's grandfather hadn't just been involved in routine intelligence gathering, he had been part of an operation that directly contributed to the success of D-Day and the eventual liberation of Europe. As the examination concluded, Dr. Chen made an offer that surprised Michael. Mr. Harrison, the National Archives would be honored to acquire your grandfather's collection for our permanent OSS records. We would ensure that the materials are properly preserved and made available to researchers, and your grandfather's contribution to the historical record would be permanently recognized. Michael asked for time to consider the offer. Part of him wanted to keep his grandfather's materials as family heirlooms, but he also recognized their importance to historians and researchers who were working to understand the complete story of World War II. That evening, as Michael prepared to return home, he wore his grandfather's jacket one more time through the halls of the National Archives. Several staff members who had heard about the discovery made a point of thanking him for bringing the materials to their attention. The drive home gave Michael time to process everything he had learned. His grandfather's secret hadn't just been about his own service, it had been about protecting the secrets of an entire operation that had remained classified for decades. The leather jacket that had started this journey now felt like it carried the weight of history itself. As he pulled into his driveway that evening, Michael realized that his investigation into his grandfather's past had revealed much more than family history. It had uncovered a piece of world history that had been missing for over 70 years. The quiet man who had never talked about the war had been carrying some of the most important secrets of the greatest conflict in human history. The jacket would never again be just a piece of old clothing. It had become a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the kind of quiet heroism that changes the world without ever seeking recognition. Michael's decision came to him 3 weeks after returning from the National Archives. He would donate his grandfather's operational materials to the archives for preservation and research, but he would keep the jacket and a few personal items. More importantly, he would help organize what General Mitchell had mentioned, a reunion of the surviving 487th Operations Group veterans. The idea had taken shape during several phone conversations with General Mitchell and Dr. Chen. There were 11 surviving members of the unit scattered across the country, most of them now in their late 80s or early 90s. They had maintained minimal contact over the decades, bound by their shared oath of secrecy but unable to fully share their experiences even with each other. With the declassification of the OSS records and the discovery of Joseph Harrison's materials, there was finally an opportunity to bring these men together to honor their shared service and to document their experiences before it was too late. General Mitchell had contacts with most of the survivors, and, within a week of Michael's decision, plans were underway for a reunion to be held in Washington, D.C. The date was set for the Saturday before Memorial Day, and the location would be the Army-Navy Club, a venue that had hosted similar gatherings for military units over the years. The planning process revealed just how remarkable the surviving members of the 487th really were. Besides General Mitchell, the group included a retired federal judge, 2 former ambassadors, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, the founder of a major electronics company, a retired college president, and several other men who had gone on to distinguished careers after the war. What struck Michael most was how humble these accomplished men were about their wartime service. During the phone calls and emails that flew back and forth during the planning process, each veteran seemed more interested in honoring his fallen comrades than in discussing his own contributions to the war effort. Frank Morrison, the retired judge from California, summed up the group's attitude during one planning call: "We were just young men doing what had to be done. The real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home, and the civilian resistance fighters who risked everything to help us." As the reunion date approached, media interest began to build. Dr. Chen had written a press release about the discovery of the 487th materials, and military history enthusiasts had picked up the story. Several newspapers wanted to interview the surviving veterans, and the History Channel had expressed interest in documenting the reunion. Michael found himself in the unexpected role of family spokesman and informal coordinator for media requests. The veterans had agreed to limited media coverage, seeing it as an opportunity to honor their fallen comrades and to educate the public about the lesser-known aspects of World War II. The week before the reunion, Michael drove to Washington early to help with final preparations. General Mitchell had arranged for several special guests to attend, including the current director of the CIA, who wanted to honor the OSS legacy, and several European dignitaries whose countries had been liberated with the help of 487th operations. Michael was staying at the same hotel as several of the veterans, and he had his first opportunity to meet some of the men who had served with his grandfather. Each encounter was emotionally powerful, as these elderly men shared memories of Joseph Harrison that no one in Michael's family had ever heard. Thomas Chen, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist, had served as the unit's intelligence analyst during the war. He remembered Michael's grandfather as someone who could adapt to any situation and who had an uncanny ability to earn the trust of resistance fighters and civilians. "Your grandfather saved my life in Holland," Chen told Michael over dinner the night before the reunion. "I was a young lieutenant, fresh out of training, and I made a mistake that compromised our position. Joe managed to get us out of enemy territory and to safety, all while carrying radio equipment that weighed more than I did." Ambassador Robert Carey, now 89, had been the unit's liaison with French resistance groups. His memories of Joseph Harrison focused on his language skills and cultural adaptability. "Joe could disappear into any European crowd," Carey recalled. "He didn't just speak the languages, he understood the cultures. He could pass for a German factory worker, a French farmer, or a Belgian shopkeeper. That ability made him invaluable for infiltration missions." The reunion itself began with a private memorial service for the 38 members of the 487th who had died during the war. Michael was honored to be asked to participate in the ceremony, representing not just his grandfather but all the families who had never known the true nature of their loved one's service. General Mitchell read the names of the fallen, and, as each name was called, one of the surviving veterans shared a brief memory. When Joseph Harrison's name was read, General Mitchell gestured for Michael to come forward. "Joseph Harrison died peacefully in his sleep 3 months ago," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "He kept his oath of secrecy until the end, but, through the materials he preserved, his service lives on. He would be honored to be remembered alongside the men who didn't make it home." The formal reunion dinner that evening was attended by over 200 people, including family members of the veterans, military historians, government officials, and representatives from several European nations. Michael wore his grandfather's jacket, and several attendees made a point of acknowledging the significance of the Apache War. During the dinner, each surviving veteran was given an opportunity to speak. Their remarks revealed the extraordinary scope of 487th operations and the personal costs of their service. Several men spoke about the resistance fighters who had died helping them, about the civilians who had sacrificed everything to support their missions, and about the comrades who had given their lives for the cause of freedom. James McDonald, the retired college president from Texas, shared a story that brought tears to many eyes in the room. "In Belgium, there was a family that hid me for 2 weeks while German patrols searched for our unit. The father was a baker, the mother was a schoolteacher, and they had 2 young children. They knew that helping me could cost them their lives, but they never hesitated. After the war, I learned that the Gestapo had discovered their activities. The entire family was executed 3 days after I was evacuated to safety. The evening's most powerful moment came when the current CIA director presented each surviving veteran with a medal that had been specially created to honor OSS service. As each man stepped forward to receive his medal, the audience rose in sustained applause that seemed to represent decades of delayed recognition and gratitude. When Michael's turn came to accept the medal on behalf of his grandfather, the applause was particularly intense. General Mitchell had arranged for the medal presentation to include a reading of some of the operations that Joseph Harrison had been involved in, based on the materials found in his trunk. Technical Sergeant Joseph Harrison participated in 37 covert operations between 1943 and 1945, the CIA director read from the citation. His service included intelligence gathering, sabotage operations, personnel extraction, and coordination with resistance groups in 4 occupied countries. His actions directly contributed to the success of D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. As Michael accepted the medal, he thought about his grandfather sitting quietly in his auto repair shop for 40 years, never mentioning that he had been part of some of the most crucial operations of World War II. The weight of that secrecy, and the honor represented by this moment, was almost overwhelming. After the formal dinner, the veterans and their families gathered in a smaller room for more personal conversations. This was when the most intimate stories were shared, and when Michael learned details about his grandfather's character that revealed the man behind the covert operative. Several veterans spoke about Joseph Harrison's sense of humor, his ability to keep morale up during difficult missions, and his skill as a mechanic that had saved their lives on multiple occasions. Joe could fix anything, remembered William Foster, the electronics company founder. Radio equipment, vehicles, weapons, if it was broken, Joe could make it work. But, more than that, he could fix things with whatever materials were available. I saw him repair a radio using parts from a German truck and wire from a French telephone line. The stories continued late into the evening, with each veteran contributing memories that painted a picture of Joseph Harrison as a man who had been not just skilled and brave, but also fundamentally decent and caring about the people around him. Michael also learned about the personal costs that all of these men had paid for their service. Several spoke about nightmares that had continued for decades after the war. Others mentioned the difficulty of returning to normal life after years of living under constant danger and stress. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating veterans, had been invited to the reunion to help the veterans process their experiences. She spoke with Michael about the long-term effects of the kind of service that the 487th veterans had performed. These men lived through experiences that would challenge anyone's mental and emotional stability, she explained. The fact that they also had to keep their experiences secret for decades added another layer of psychological stress. Your grandfather's decision to preserve his materials while maintaining his secrecy was probably his way of honoring his service while protecting his mental health. The reunion continued for 3 days, with various activities planned to honor the veterans and document their experiences. A historian from the Smithsonian conducted recorded interviews with each veteran, creating an oral history that would be preserved for future generations. Michael participated in his grandfather's interview, sharing the story of discovering the trunk and the jacket, and reading excerpts from his grandfather's personal notebook that had been decoded at the National Archives. One of the most meaningful events was a visit to the World War II Memorial, where the veterans laid wreaths in honor of their fallen comrades. Michael placed a wreath specifically for his grandfather, reading his name aloud as the other veterans stood at attention. The media coverage of the reunion exceeded everyone's expectations. Major newspapers, television networks, and online news sources carried stories about the 487th Operations Group and their newly revealed contributions to the war effort. The Discovery Channel announced plans for a documentary about the unit, with Michael's grandfather's materials serving as a central element of the historical narrative. More importantly for Michael, the reunion provided closure for questions that had troubled him since discovering his grandfather's trunk. He now understood not just what his grandfather had done during the war, but why he had chosen to remain silent about it afterward. The other veterans helped Michael see that his grandfather's secrecy hadn't been about shame or trauma, but about honor and humility. Joseph Harrison had carried out his duty with distinction, and, then, had carried the secret of that duty with equal distinction. On the final evening of the reunion, General Mitchell asked Michael to join him for a private conversation. They walked through the gardens behind the Army-Navy Club, the leather jacket draped over Michael's arm as they talked. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you've done," the general said. "By finding those materials and bringing us together, you've given us something we never thought we'd have, the chance to honor our service and our fallen comrades properly." Michael nodded, understanding that the reunion had been as important for the surviving veterans as it had been for preserving history. "I still can't believe that all of this started with just cleaning out his attic." "That's the thing about honor and service," General Mitchell replied. "It doesn't diminish with time or secrecy. Your grandfather's courage was just as real sitting in that auto repair shop as it was behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. The jacket you're carrying represents both versions of the man, the covert operative, and the quiet civilian who never broke his oath." As the reunion ended and the veterans prepared to return to their homes across the country, Michael realized that he had gained something more valuable than historical knowledge. He had gained a new understanding of his grandfather as a complete person, not just the quiet man who had raised a family and run a business, but also the young hero who had risked everything for his country and for freedom. The 11 surviving veterans exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch more regularly. Several mentioned that the reunion had given them permission to finally talk about experiences they had kept secret for over 70 years. As Michael packed his grandfather's jacket for the trip home, he knew that its significance had evolved yet again. It was no longer just a family heirloom or a historical artifact, it had become a bridge between generations, a symbol of service that connected his grandfather's generation with his own, and a reminder that heroism often wears the most ordinary faces. The reunion had revealed the final secret of the leather jacket, that true honor doesn't demand recognition, but, when recognition finally comes, it illuminates not just individual courage, but the courage of an entire generation that saved the world. 6 months after the reunion, Michael found himself standing in front of a classroom at Jefferson High School, wearing his grandfather's leather jacket and preparing to speak to a group of 11th grade history students. What had begun as a personal journey of discovery had evolved into something much larger, a mission to ensure that the stories of the 487th Operations Group and other unsung heroes of World War II were not forgotten. The invitation to speak at the school had come through Dr. Chen at the National Archives, who had been contacted by teachers across the country seeking authentic historical perspectives for their World War II units. Michael had initially been reluctant to take on a public speaking role, but General Mitchell had convinced him that sharing his grandfather's story was a form of service in itself. "Every generation needs to understand what freedom costs," the general had told him during one of their regular phone conversations. "Your grandfather's story isn't just about the past, it's about the values and courage that every generation needs to protect democracy." The students were initially skeptical about another World War II presentation, but their attitude changed quickly as Michael began to tell the story of finding his grandfather's trunk and discovering the secrets it contained. He had learned to structure his presentations around the mystery and discovery process, keeping his audience engaged by revealing information in the same way he had learned it. When he showed the students photographs of the trunk contents and explained how each item had revealed new aspects of his grandfather's service, their interest was obvious. Several students asked detailed questions about the OSS operations, and one young woman wanted to know how Michael had felt when he realized his grandfather had been a spy. "It wasn't like in the movies," Michael explained. "Real intelligence work was mostly about being careful, being smart, and being brave when it mattered. My grandfather wasn't jumping off buildings or driving fancy cars, he was using his skills as a mechanic and his ability to blend into different cultures to help save lives and gather information that helped win the war." After his presentation, Michael was approached by Maria Santos, a senior who was working on a history project about local World War II veterans. She explained that her own great-grandfather had served in the Pacific Theater, but that he had also never talked about his experiences. "Do you think there might be other families with secrets like yours?" she asked. The question had been troubling Michael since the reunion. Dr. Chen had estimated that there might be hundreds of families across the country who had relatives who served in classified units during the war, but who had never learned about their loved ones' real contributions to the war effort. This realization had led Michael to work with Dr. Chen and General Mitchell on a new project, the creation of a database and outreach program designed to help families discover hidden military histories. They had started with OSS veterans, but had expanded to include other classified units from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The project, which they called the Hidden Heroes Initiative, had already yielded remarkable results. Families across the country had come forward with mysterious military items, unexplained medals, and stories that didn't match official records. Many of these had led to the discovery of classified service that had never been properly recognized. One of the most significant discoveries had come from a family in Oregon who had found documents indicating that their father had been involved in the Manhattan Project. Another family in Texas had learned that their grandfather had been part of a classified Navy unit that had conducted underwater demolition operations in the Pacific. Each discovery not only honored individual veterans but also helped historians piece together a more complete picture of the war effort. The Hidden Heroes Initiative had become a model for how historical research could be conducted collaboratively between professional historians and family members who possessed important but unrecognized materials. Michael had also become involved in efforts to preserve the stories of the surviving 487th veterans. The reunion had been so successful that plans were underway for an annual gathering, not just of the 487th, but of all surviving OSS veterans and their families. General Mitchell, now 91, had become a close friend and mentor to Michael. Their relationship had evolved beyond the shared connection to Joseph Harrison into something resembling a grandfather-grandson bond that neither man had expected. During one of their conversations, the general had shared something that profoundly affected Michael's understanding of his role as the keeper of his grandfather's legacy. "Your grandfather spent his entire adult life carrying the weight of secrets that he could never share," General Mitchell had said. "Now you're carrying those same secrets, but with the freedom to share them in ways that honor his service and educate others. That's a responsibility, but it's also an opportunity that your grandfather never had." This perspective had helped Michael understand that his growing role as a public speaker and historical advocate wasn't just about his grandfather, it was about all the veterans whose stories had been lost to classification, secrecy, and time. The media attention surrounding the 487th reunion had led to other speaking opportunities. Michael had addressed veteran groups, historical societies, and even a congressional subcommittee that was reviewing procedures for declassifying historical military documents. Each speaking engagement taught him something new about the broader implications of his grandfather's story. At the congressional hearing, he had learned that there were still thousands of World War II documents that remained classified for bureaucratic rather than security reasons. His testimony had contributed to a bipartisan effort to accelerate the declassification of historical military records. The most emotionally powerful speaking engagement had been at a reunion of the 82nd Airborne Division, where Michael had met several D-Day veterans who had benefited directly from intelligence gathered by OSS units like the 487th. These elderly soldiers had thanked him for his grandfather's service, explaining how accurate intelligence about German positions had saved American lives during the Normandy invasion. "Your grandfather and men like him are the reason I'm alive today," one veteran had told him. "We went into France knowing what to expect because of the intelligence they provided. That knowledge saved thousands of lives." These encounters helped Michael understand the far-reaching effects of his grandfather's wartime service and reinforced his commitment to ensuring that such contributions were properly recognized and remembered. The leather jacket had become Michael's constant companion during these speaking engagements. He wore it not as a costume or prop, but as a way of keeping his grandfather's presence with him as he shared the story. The jacket had developed an almost mythical status among World War II enthusiasts, and Michael had received offers from collectors and museums who wanted to acquire it. He had politely declined all such offers. The jacket belonged with his family, and, more importantly, it served as a tangible connection between his grandfather's generation and the audiences Michael spoke to. When students or veterans could see and touch something that had actually been worn during covert operations, the historical reality became more immediate and meaningful. Dr. Chen had helped Michael understand the historical significance of keeping the jacket in active use rather than preserving it in a museum display. "Living history is more powerful than static history," she had explained. "When people see you wearing that jacket and hear the stories it represents, they're experiencing history in a way that no display case could provide." The jacket had also led to unexpected discoveries about other members of Michael's family. After news coverage of the 487th reunion, he had been contacted by distant relatives who had their own stories about family members who had served in classified units. One cousin from California revealed that her father had been a codebreaker during the war, working on Japanese diplomatic ciphers. Another relative from New York had discovered that his uncle had been involved in counterintelligence operations in Italy. These discoveries suggested that Joseph Harrison's service might have been part of a larger pattern of classified military service within their extended family. Most significantly, Michael had been contacted by the children of several other 487th veterans who had died without revealing their wartime service. These families had their own collections of mysterious military items and unexplained stories that made sense only in the context of OSS operations. Working with these families had become one of Michael's most rewarding activities. He had helped several families understand their relatives' service and had facilitated connections with surviving 487th veterans who had known their fathers or grandfathers. The Hidden Heroes Initiative had expanded beyond individual family discoveries to become a resource for researchers, filmmakers, and authors who were working on projects related to classified military operations. The database had grown to include information about hundreds of previously unknown classified service members, creating a valuable resource for understanding the full scope of American intelligence operations during the Cold War era. Michael had also become involved in efforts to improve support for military families dealing with classified service. He had learned that the psychological challenges his grandfather had faced were still affecting modern military families whose loved ones served in classified roles. Working with military family support organizations, Michael had helped develop programs that provided resources for families dealing with the unique stresses of classified military service. His grandfather's story had become a case study in how families could maintain connections despite the barriers created by security requirements. The most recent development in Michael's advocacy work had been an invitation to serve on a Department of Defense committee that was reviewing policies for supporting military families affected by classified service. His personal experience and his research into historical cases had provided valuable perspectives for policy discussions about balancing security requirements with family support needs. As the first anniversary of the 487th reunion approached, Michael reflected on how much his life had changed since that day when he had climbed the stairs to his grandfather's attic. What had begun as a simple estate cleanup had evolved into a calling that connected him to history, honored his grandfather's service, and helped other families discover their own hidden legacies. The leather jacket hanging in his closet was no longer just a family heirloom, it had become a symbol of the broader truth that heroes often serve in silence, that families carry historical secrets they don't even know they possess, and that the most important stories are often the ones that are never told until someone has the courage to share them. Michael had begun working on a book about his grandfather's story and the broader phenomenon of classified military service. The book would combine his personal journey of discovery with the stories of other families who had uncovered hidden military legacies. Dr. Chen was serving as a historical consultant for the project, and General Mitchell had agreed to write the foreword. The book represented Michael's commitment to ensuring that his grandfather's story and others like it would be preserved for future generations. It would also serve as a guide for other families who might have their own hidden histories waiting to be discovered. As Michael prepared for another speaking engagement, this time at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, he carefully packed his grandfather's jacket in his travel bag. The jacket would make the journey from small-town attics to national museums, from family secrets to historical recognition, and from one generation's silence to another generation's understanding. The final secret of the jacket had been revealed, that true heroism creates legacies that extend far beyond the individual hero's lifetime, inspiring future generations to serve, to remember, and to ensure that the stories of courage and sacrifice are never forgotten. Joseph Harrison had kept his secrets for 70 years, but those secrets had ultimately become the foundation for a legacy that honored not just his own service, but the service of countless other heroes whose stories had been lost to time. The old jacket that he had worn behind enemy lines had become a bridge between past and present, between silence and recognition, between individual sacrifice and collective memory. In wearing his grandfather's jacket and sharing his grandfather's story, Michael had discovered his own calling to ensure that the heroes who served in silence would finally be heard, that the families who carried hidden legacies would find the truth they sought, and that the values of courage, honor, and sacrifice would continue to inspire future generations. The journey that had begun with curiosity about an old jacket had become a mission to preserve the memory of an entire generation of hidden heroes. And, in fulfilling that mission, Michael had found a way to honor not just his grandfather's service, but the service of all who had sacrificed in silence for the cause of freedom.